They called it the Age of the Sword. Japan had just been unified under one man, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a warlord with an empire's hunger and a vision that stretched beyond the islands. In 1592, he launched an invasion the world wasn't ready for. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of samurai, a force so massive it darkened the horizon. Korea, peaceful for centuries, was caught unprepared. Cities burned, fortresses fell, and as the Japanese tide swept north, one man refused to bow. Admiral Yi Sun-sin, a commander with no army left to command. 13 ships against 300. This is the story of how he turned the sea itself into a weapon and carved his name into history.
The sea lay still, that kind of glassy stillness that feels wrong before a storm. Fishermen off the southern coast of Korea whispered of dark shapes in the distance, black sails stretching across the horizon. Some said they were just merchant convoys heading north. Others said they'd seen firelight on the water, torches moving in columns like an army marching at sea. It wasn't rumour, it was prophecy. Because across the strait a storm had already begun to gather. In Japan the year was 1592, the dawn of a new empire, and one man stood at its centre, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Born a peasant, he had clawed his way to absolute power through charisma, brutality, and genius. He was not a man of bloodline, but of ambition, and ambition burns hotter than any crown. He had done what generations of warlords couldn't, unified Japan. After a century of chaos, samurai banners finally flew under one authority. Daimyo, who had once battled each other for scraps of land, now bowed before him. And yet, even that victory wasn't enough. Hideyoshi wasn't content with peace. He despised it. Peace was stagnation. He looked across the sea at the Asian continent, Korea, China, and beyond, and saw not neighbours, but stepping stones. His dream wasn't just conquest, it was transcendence. To make Japan the centre of the known world. Hideyoshi's orders spread like wildfire. Provinces conscripted men, foundries poured iron, blacksmiths forged muskets, blades, and armour day and night. Ports filled with shipbuilders crafting a navy unlike anything Asia had seen before. Thousands of vessels from heavy galleys to massive transports armed with cannons and fire weapons. Every island contributed soldiers. Samurai sharpened swords. Peasants were handed spears. Monks blessed war banners in temple courtyards. The sound of drums echoed from one end of Japan to the other. When the invasion force was assembled, it dwarfed anything the region had ever witnessed. More than 150,000 men, armoured divisions under famous generals, Konishi Yukinaga, Kato Kiyomasa, and others whose names would soon carve scars across the peninsula. Samurai cavalry gleamed in the morning sun, matchlock gunners marched in perfect rhythm, and supply caravans stretched for miles. From above it must have looked like an entire nation on the move. The invasion wasn't just military, it was psychological. Every detail was meant to shock, intimidate, and break the will of any who stood against them. And the first to face that terror would be the Joseon dynasty of Korea. The Korean court in Seoul was still asleep when the first reports came in. Sailors out of Busan described hundreds of ships approaching the southern harbours. Government officials dismissed it as exaggeration, until refugees began flooding north, bringing tales of slaughter. The Japanese army moved with terrifying precision. Within days the port city of Busan fell. The defenders were cut down to the last man. Japanese banners were planted on the walls, their muskets echoing through streets that once held markets and music. Hideyoshi's commanders advanced in waves, land armies pushing north, naval squadrons circling the coasts. Every fortress that resisted was burned. Entire towns vanished overnight. Villages that surrendered were forced to supply food and women to the invaders. The Koreans were stunned. Their army, small and unprepared, crumbled. Their weapons, bows, swords, and matchlocks of lesser quality, couldn't match the Japanese firearms or the discipline of veteran samurai. By the second week, the Japanese had marched halfway up the peninsula. Even Seoul, the capital, fell without a major siege. Royal officials fled north to Pyongyang, desperate and divided. No one could believe what was happening. The Joseon dynasty had lived in peace for 2 centuries, and now, in less than a month, their nation was collapsing. At sea, the situation was equally grim. The Japanese navy, massive and well-organized, controlled the supply routes. Korean ports were bombarded or captured one by one. Merchant ships were sunk or seized. Coastal villages burned, their smoke mixing with the salt of the sea. But far to the west, one man was watching. Quietly, methodically, and with absolute focus. His name was Yi Sun-sin. He wasn't born into power either. Like Hideyoshi, he had clawed his way upward, not through ambition, but through sheer competence. Every order he gave was precise, every movement planned, and unlike most commanders, Yi didn't see the sea as a barrier. He saw it as a battlefield. To him, the ocean was alive, an ally, not an obstacle. When others saw the Japanese fleet as an unstoppable wall, Yi studied its weaknesses. He noticed the ships were heavy, built for transport more than agility. He studied their formations, their gun placements, their reliance on predictable tides. Then he started crafting something different. Yi's fleet wasn't large, but it was designed. His flagship, the Panoxion, was wider and sturdier than Japanese vessels, able to turn and fire broadsides with devastating precision. But the jewel of his navy was the Geobuksun, the turtle ship, a low armoured beast covered in spiked plating, armed with rows of cannons and a dragon's head at its bow that could belch smoke to obscure its movements. To most, it looked like myth. To Yi, it was science. But politics doesn't reward competence. Court factions, jealous of his growing fame, accused him of disloyalty. They claimed he ignored royal orders and spread false reports. Despite his victories in earlier naval engagements, Yi was stripped of command, beaten, and imprisoned. The Korean navy, leaderless and desperate, fell apart without him. By the time he was reinstated, the damage was catastrophic. The once proud fleet that had numbered over 150 ships was reduced to 13. 13 ships, against hundreds. Any ordinary man would have surrendered. But Yi wasn't ordinary. When others saw numbers, he saw movement. When others saw doom, he saw opportunity. He told his remaining captains, "If we fight on open water, we die. If we run, we die. But if we fight where the sea itself becomes our ally, we live." He unfurled a map and placed his finger on a narrow passage of water. Myeongnyang Strait. It was a death trap for anyone who didn't understand it. The Strait of Myeongnyang. Myeongnyang was no ordinary channel. The tides there were savage, reversing direction every 3 hours, creating whirlpools and violent undercurrents that could tear apart a fleet. Even local fishermen avoided it during rough weather. Yi decided it was perfect. He spent days studying tide tables, wind direction, and visibility patterns. He learned the rhythm of the water, the exact moments when the tide would shift and the currents would turn chaotic. His plan was simple in design, impossible in execution. Lure the Japanese navy into the strait, trap them as the currents reversed, and let nature destroy them. His officers were horrified. 13 ships couldn't face 300, but he didn't flinch, he wrote in his war diary that night. "My only fear is failing my country. The number of ships means nothing. Courage and tide, that is enough." When dawn came, his fleet moved into position. They sailed into the strait quietly, anchoring just beyond the midpoint. Behind them, steep cliffs rose like walls. The wind howled through the channel, carrying the smell of salt and iron. From his command deck, he could see the enemy in the distance. Hundreds of Japanese vessels, their banners fluttering crimson and gold under a rising sun. He watched them approach like a tide of wood and steel. The Japanese believed they were chasing a broken enemy, a handful of battered ships making a final stand. What they didn't realize was that every meter they advanced pulled them deeper into a labyrinth of shifting currents. Yi waited until the tide began to turn. Then he gave the order, "Hold fire." His men stood silent. The Japanese kept coming. At 500 meters, still silence. At 300 meters, the current shifted. Suddenly the sea erupted. Whirlpools formed between the ships. Japanese galleys collided. Their rows of musketeers couldn't steady their aim. The front lines tangled together, their formation collapsing in seconds. He raised his sword. The Korean drums thundered across the water. Boom, boom, boom. Then came the roar of cannons. Yi's fleet unleashed a perfectly timed broadside, the smoke rolling across the strait like a storm. Cannonballs smashed through the Japanese vanguard. Ships burst into flame. The echo bounced between the cliffs like thunder. The tide turned again, literally. The current, reversing direction, dragged the Japanese ships backward into each other. It was chaos. And in that chaos, Yi Sun-sin proved what true command meant. He didn't just fight the enemy. He controlled the battlefield itself. The roar of the tide drowned out everything. Wind howled between the cliffs. The sea churned, white-capped and furious. And in the middle of it all, 13 ships stood against hundreds. Admiral Yi Sun-sin gripped the rail of his flagship, eyes locked on the storm of ships ahead. To his crew, it must have looked like madness. To Yi, it was mathematics, a perfect collision of courage, current, and chaos. The Japanese fleet pressed forward, their rows of war banners slicing through the morning haze. They believed they had victory within reach. Muskets flashed. Arrows rained down. Their oarsmen screamed over the sound of thunder, but Yi didn't move. He waited. The sea itself would strike first. As the Japanese front line pushed deeper into the strait, the current shifted again, violently as Yi had predicted. The water beneath them surged backward, spinning their ships sideways. The tight formation fractured instantly. Galleys slammed into one another, masts splintered, and soldiers fell into the water. Yi raised his sword high and shouted the order, "Fire!" The Korean fleet unleashed its wrath. Rows of cannons thundered from the Penoxion, hurling iron and flame into the Japanese mass. Smoke swallowed the strait. From the cliffs above, echoes rolled like mountain thunder. Each shot found its mark. Yi's gunners didn't fire wildly. They had spent the previous night calculating the range, rehearsing every step. They fired, reloaded, and fired again, mechanical precision guided by one man's mind. Japanese ships burst into flames, their gunpowder igniting. Cries of panic filled the air. The current dragged the burning vessels into the next wave of ships, spreading chaos through the entire formation. Yi turned to his officers and said calmly, "Now the tide fights for us." As the battle raged, the Gearbuxiana, the turtle ship, emerged through the smoke. Its iron hull glistened with seawater and firelight. Spikes lined its shell, preventing enemy boarders. The dragon head at its bow poured black smoke to shroud its approach. The Japanese soldiers shouted warnings, firing matchlocks into the haze, but the bullets bounced harmlessly off the armoured plating. The turtle ship rammed into the nearest galley, shattering its hull and capsizing it in seconds. It was like watching a monster rise from the deep, smoke, iron and thunder moving as one. Behind it, the smaller Korean ships followed in tight formation, flanking and firing in perfect rhythm. Yi's men shouted battle cries that mixed with the sound of drums. Every shot, every movement was synchronized. The Japanese fought back fiercely. Their musketeers fired volleys that ripped into the Korean decks. Archers aimed for the officers, but Yi stood tall at the front of his ship, visible to every man in his fleet. He refused to hide. A bullet tore through the sleeve of his armour. Another struck the mast beside him, but he didn't move. He lifted his bow, drew an arrow, and shot a Japanese officer clean through the chest. His men saw it and roared. Their admiral wasn't just commanding the fight, he was part of it. "Look at our commander," one sailor shouted. "Even death bows to him." The morale of 13 ships surged to that of an entire fleet. Meanwhile, the Japanese line disintegrated. Their admirals tried to issue orders, but the currents were turning faster than they could react. Ships spun helplessly, slamming into one another. Drums and horns vanished beneath the roar of water and cannon fire. The Myeongnyang Strait had become a trap, a graveyard of splintered wood and smoke. Yi's fleet manoeuvred like dancers in chaos. Each Korean ship turned in sequence, firing broadsides before pulling back with the current. The precision was unbelievable. Even with a fraction of their enemies' numbers, they made it look like they had the advantage. As the tide turned again, Yi gave one final command. "Press forward!" His ship surged ahead through debris and flame. The turtle ship led the charge, smashing into the broken remains of the enemy line. The Japanese flagship tried to rally what was left, but it was too late. Their gunpowder was soaked, their sails torn. Some tried to flee, others grounded their ships on the cliffs. The current that had carried them to victory in so many seas had turned against them, and the sea showed no mercy. By dusk, the water ran black with ash and oil. The Japanese had lost nearly a third of their fleet. Hundreds of their ships sank, burned, or were abandoned. Bodies floated between the wrecks, carried away by the same current that had betrayed them. 13 Korean ships remained, battered, scorched, but afloat. Yi Sun-sin stood at the bow of his flagship as the smoke cleared. His face was streaked with salt and soot, his armour dented, but his eyes burned with calm. He looked out over the ruined sea and whispered, "Heaven has not abandoned us." That night his men lit lanterns across the decks. The glow shimmered on the waves like stars. They had faced 300 ships and survived. The news spread across Korea like wildfire. Villagers fell to their knees in prayer. Soldiers on land wept when they heard. The impossible had happened. A broken navy had destroyed the invincible Japanese fleet. Admiral Yi had given his country something more powerful than victory. He had given them belief. Strategic masterclass and naval innovation. In the days after the battle, Yi's officers gathered around the war table. They expected celebration. Yi gave them analysis. He spent hours dissecting every maneuver, every mistake, every turn of the tide. To him, victory was not divine. It was deliberate. He explained how he'd positioned his ships where the current's reversal would maximize their firing arcs, how he'd used the narrow cliffs to block Japanese flanking routes, how he'd timed his volleys between the enemy's reload cycles. It wasn't luck, it was a logic wrapped in intuition. He told his men, "The tide is not our enemy, the tide is our army. If you know its rhythm, it fights for you." He understood what no one else did, that control of the sea wasn't about numbers, it was about timing, terrain, and fear. He used psychological warfare long before the term existed. He'd feigned retreat to lure the Japanese in, forced them into bottlenecks, and unleashed sudden counterfire at their most vulnerable moment. His mastery of anticipation turned the enemy's aggression into their downfall. And then there was technology. The Geobuk Seon, his turtle ship, became legend across Asia. Its spiked iron shell made boarding impossible. Its low deck absorbed cannon fire without capsizing, and its ability to emit dense smoke through the dragon's mouth made it both terrifying and tactically brilliant, obscuring visibility while signalling allies. He designed it not as a weapon of destruction, but as a weapon of control, a floating fortress, a psychological blade. Even the Ming Chinese generals who arrived later admitted that no commander in the world had used naval science with such precision. Yi's methods, they said, made the sea itself an extension of his command, legacy of a miracle. In Seoul, the court that once doubted Yi was stunned. The same ministers who had stripped his title now rushed to restore his honour. Messengers carried royal decrees praising his divine victory. But Yi refused celebration. He rebuilt. He ordered new ships, repaired cannons, trained new sailors, because he knew this war was not over. The victory at Myeongnyang had halted the Japanese advance, but it hadn't ended it. Hideyoshi still dreamed of conquest. The Japanese army still occupied parts of southern Korea, yet Yi had cut off their supply lines. The invaders now fought hungry, trapped, and afraid. For the first time in years, Korea had hope. Yi became more than an admiral. He became a legend in real time, the symbol of resistance, discipline, and brilliance under impossible odds. But even legends are mortal. In 1598, during the Battle of Myeongnyang, Yi faced his final fight. The Japanese were retreating, cornered but desperate. Yi led his fleet one last time, and in the middle of the chaos a stray bullet struck him. He fell silently. As his nephew caught him, Yi whispered, "The war is at its height. Do not announce my death." He died standing, still watching the horizon, still commanding. The Koreans won that day, but their greatest commander was gone. Epilogue The Undying Tide. Centuries later, historians would call it impossible. 13 ships against 300. A miracle of strategy. A divine intervention. But Yi Sun-sin never claimed divinity. He claimed understanding. He didn't just fight the Japanese. He fought physics, arrogance, and fate. And he won. The Battle of Myeongnyang stands as one of the greatest underdog victories in history. Not because of luck, but because one man refused to surrender to numbers. He proved that in the hands of genius, even the tide can become an army. And as long as ships still sail and wars are still fought, the lesson remains the same. The sea does not belong to the strong. It belongs to those who understand it. Morning broke over the western sea in silence. The smoke from Myeongnyang had finally drifted away, leaving behind a graveyard of ships. Burnt hulls bobbed like blackened bones. The waves that had once howled with cannon fire now whispered against the wreckage. Gulls circled above, their cries echoing across the strait. Admiral Yi Sun-sin stood on the deck of his flagship, his face drawn but steady. His armor was dented, the blue silk beneath stained with salt and ash. Around him, the sea shimmered gold beneath the rising sun, as if trying to wash away the blood that stained its memory. He looked at the horizon and saw what few men could ever see. Not victory, but survival. For days his fleet moved slowly along the coast, rescuing stranded sailors and pulling supplies from the wrecks of Japanese ships. Every plank, every cannon, every musket was salvaged. To Yi, nothing was wasted. Each fragment would become part of a new fleet. Each scar would become a lesson. He ordered repairs immediately. Carpenters hammered through the night. Blacksmiths worked by firelight, reforging shattered cannonballs into usable metal. Sailors who had faced death days before sang work songs under the moon, their voices raw but alive. The sea that had once threatened to swallow them now carried their hope. Yi didn't allow triumph, he allowed focus. Meanwhile, the Japanese commanders reeled from the defeat. The Myeongnyang disaster had rippled across the entire warfront. Their supply lines were broken. Armies inland, once unstoppable, now starved. Without reinforcements or food, they began to retreat. In Kyoto, Toyotomi Hideyoshi's rage was volcanic. He slammed his fist against the council table, sending inkpots flying. The warlords who once hailed him as a visionary now avoided his gaze. The unthinkable had happened. His empire's ambition had been stopped not by an army, not by a nation, but by 13 ships and a single man. But Hideyoshi refused to accept defeat. He demanded a new campaign, another invasion, another chance to erase the humiliation. Yet the tide, both literal and political, had already turned. China had now entered the war fully. The Ming Navy began coordinating with Yi's fleet, sending envoys to meet him on the Korean coast. What they saw stunned them. Where they expected desperation, they found discipline. Yi's ships, though small in number, were immaculate. Rows of newly tarred hulls gleaming black, cannon ports shining with fresh bronze, sailors trained in formation, the thud of their drums rolling over the sea like heartbeat. His command structure ran with the precision of a blade's edge. Even the Ming envoys, men hardened by decades of war, called it a navy born from ashes. One Chinese admiral asked Yi how he had survived Myeongnyang. Yi simply said, "The tide carried me where courage alone could not." As the months passed, Yi rebuilt his fleet to more than 50 ships. The turtle ship returned, rebuilt, refitted, and deadlier than ever. But the Japanese threat still loomed. From their strongholds in the south, their navy prepared for a final confrontation. They would try to break free before the winter seas froze them in place. Yi expected it. He knew the Japanese weren't finished. They were cornered, not crushed. And a cornered beast is dangerous. He spent weeks charting every island, every current, every shallow reef between the southern ports and the Yellow Sea. His maps became weapons, diagrams of death for any who dared cross them. He wrote in his log, "The sea is a mirror. If you study it long enough, it will show you every weakness of your enemy." Then came Myeongnyang, December 1598. The sea was colder, the air sharp as steel. Frost coated the decks of the Mamluk ships. Breath turned to mist. The combined fleets of Korea and China faced the last remnant of Hideyoshi's navy. Hundreds of ships loaded with exhausted troops desperate to escape. Yi positioned his fleet at the mouth of the Myeongnyang Strait, blocking their retreat. The Japanese had nowhere to run but through him. Before the battle, he addressed his men. "We have fought the tide before. We have turned defeat into victory, but today we fight for peace, for the right to end this war forever." The drums began to beat. The first wave of Japanese ships approached under cover of fog. Yi's fleet opened fire, cannon flashes illuminating the mist like lightning. The clash was instant and total. For hours, the two sides battered each other in the narrow strait. The air filled with smoke and fire, ships rammed. Men screamed. Arrows and cannonballs crossed paths like stars. Yi stood at the centre of it all, shouting orders, his voice hoarse but unshaken. The turtle ship rammed through the enemy line, tearing holes in their formation. Korean and Chinese cannons fired in unison, breaking hulls and shattering morale. Then, fate struck. A musket ball tore through the air and hit Yi just below the shoulder. He stumbled, gripping the railing. His nephew rushed forward, but Yi raised a trembling hand. "Do not announce my death," he whispered. "The war is at its height." He stood one last time looking out over the battle. His ships were winning. The tide was turning one final time. For him. Then he fell. The sun rose the next morning over a quiet sea. The Japanese had been crushed. What remained of their fleet drifted south in silence. Yi's death was kept secret until victory was certain. His men fought harder after he fell, as if his spirit had fused with the tide itself. When they finally laid him to rest, the waves rolled gently against the shore, as though bowing. Legacy of a miracle. Years later, poets called it the miracle at sea. Historians called it strategy. Soldiers called it hope. The Battle of Myeongnyang and the life of Yi Sun-sin became something larger than legend. They became the blueprint for the impossible. Yi's journals, preserved and studied, revealed not a mystic, but a mind that fused science and soul. He wrote of wind pressure, water temperature, tide timing, details centuries ahead of their time. He was a commander who fought like a mathematician and prayed like a monk. The Japanese never again invaded Korea. Hideyoshi died the same year as Yi, his empire crumbling into infighting and loss. Two men, one driven by greed, the other by duty, had collided, and only one left a legacy worth remembering. In Korea, Yi became immortal. Statues of him now guard the harbours he once defended. His name lives in the rhythm of the waves, in the sound of the drums that echo through naval ceremonies. But his greatest monument isn't carved in bronze or stone. It's the idea he left behind. That victory is not always about strength. Sometimes it's about understanding the rhythm of the world, the patience to wait for the tide to turn, and the courage to stand your ground when it does. He proved that 13 ships could defy an empire. That intelligence could outlast arrogance, that the sea itself could become a soldier. And even now, when storms rise over the Korean Strait and thunder rolls through the valleys, the sailors there still whisper a name, not as a memory but as a presence. Yi Sun-sin, the man who taught the sea how to fight,